My areas of concern are that this site will never get cleaned up and it will affect the value of our land for my kids in the future. It is the responsibility of the Alberta government because I have no choice because I only own the surface rights. It depreciates my land value if this problem is not solved. I have legacy wells on my land, and I am concerned that they will not be cleaned up and devalue my land. This well was drilled by Shell in 1963. It's gone through many different owners. The last person is a foreign-owned company. So this was passed on from a super major company to a foreign-owned company in December of 2020. It is a very old site, and it is going to be expensive for whoever cleans it up. When I got here, I insisted on at least building a fence around here so I didn't have a horse die in this mess. There is no reason for this company to clean up this flare pit. Now this site is my largest area of concern of all the well sites on my land. They have drilled this well site, but because it wasn't that great, this company has not restored this well site back so that they can produce around it. It just looks the way they had a rig on it. There's erosion issues all along this side. There's weed issues that I have to deal with as a farmer. As you know, foxtail barley, horses choke on that. I want the government of Alberta to incentivize the companies that own these liabilities now to be able to clean them up.
The reason why there's so many liabilities in Alberta is because the wells that were drilled 70 years ago, the wells that we need to thank for making Alberta who it is today, were not drilled to today's current environmental standards. So they just keep getting passed around from one sale to another sale.
Legacy well is a term used by industry to describe older wells that were drilled in an era of different environmental regulations, which according to today's standards is not considered up to code. For example, a well that was drilled in 1955 does not meet today's current environmental climate. Producers are constantly being challenged with reclaiming wells where the environmental standards by the governments are always changing.
The reason why companies take on liabilities is because there's no choice. This is the same story as the 2008 mortgage crisis, where they wrapped high-risk mortgages with the good mortgages, and they sold them off cheaply to banks. Eventually, the high-risk mortgages defaulted, which led to a world economic collapse. This is the same thing that's happening today in Alberta. Every time the government changes the regulations, it increases the cost for the liabilities, so larger companies are taking their liabilities, wrapping them up with the good assets, and sell them off cheap. Usually to small companies, because there's no funding for small companies and that's all they can afford.
Currently in the oil and gas industry, small companies and intermediate producers are forced to buy high liabilities along with good producing assets. This poses a problem to the environment and industry because legacy wells, which have been around for generations, are often left to smaller producers with ever-changing environmental standards.
I think what has happened over the years is that because we've had a problem with doing well cleanup in a timely way, a lot of these smaller players just inherit legacy problems. And I think there's a disconnect with the public. The public thinks that because there's a liability that exists today and the companies have it on their books, that they're the ones who created it. And in a lot of cases, it's just not how it worked out. In a lot of cases, many of the worst well sites were created in the 60s and 70s, sometimes with the big companies. And then just over time, as you end up with mergers, acquisitions, and divestments, you end up having to take a lot of the good producing wells with the bad ones. And as a result, we've just been kicking this liability forward. So I have a lot of sympathy for the junior oil and gas sector. They want to be able to employ people, they want to be able to drill new wells, and they're really carrying a liability forward that I think they want to clean up, but it's a matter of giving them the incentives and the means to be able to do it.
Some familiar names have filed for bankruptcy.
These companies are entering bankruptcy, restructuring.
The reason why small junior oil and gas companies are disappearing is because there's no funding. There's three main reasons for that. The first reason was the government implemented Directive 6, which was the introduction of the LMR ratio system, where the government assigned a liability cost for each well and an asset value for each well. And if these are equal, then you have a ratio of 1. If you have twice as many asset values as your liability cost, you have a ratio of 2. If you have more liabilities than asset value, it means you're below 1. And now the government can demand a deposit from those companies. A lot of those companies never had the money for that deposit, and therefore they went into receivership. And the good assets got sold off, and the bad assets went into the Orphan Well Association, otherwise known as the OWA. The number 2 reason why there's no funding is because the government made changes to this Directive 6. They made a big change in 2013 where they recalculated how they valued your liability cost and how they valued your asset. This resulted in higher liabilities and less asset value. So again, immediately, a lot of companies were flipped upside down and they could not afford the deposit demanded by the government. So a lot of companies went into receivership and the good assets got sold off and the bad assets went to the OWA. Then in 2016, the government changed the Directive 6 again and stated that from now on, any sales had to have twice as many assets as liabilities. Well, a lot of companies never had that many assets. So therefore now they were frozen. They couldn't sell any more assets off, and off to receivership they went. The good assets got sold off and the poor assets went into the OWA. The third and final nail in the coffin for why there's no funding for small junior oil and gas companies was the Supreme Court of Canada Redwater decision. This set the precedent that all liabilities come before creditors, meaning any proceeds from a receivership now went to the government to recover their estimated liability costs before any proceeds would go to the creditors. This immediately ceased all funding for small junior oil and gas companies. In fact, a lot of companies just walked away from their companies and gave the keys to the OWA.
I think the way small oil and gas companies can be more competitive is that we've got to find a way to ensure that they have dollars coming into their operations. And because they're carrying the albatross of these huge liabilities around them with no real means to go to the market now and raise capital, I like the idea of trying to find a way to turn those liabilities into an asset. Because if you can go out to the marketplace, especially in this world of ESG investing, environmental, social, and governance, and say, hey, look, I want to borrow money to clean up $10 million worth of well sites, then you can get the money in, do the well site cleanup, and that improves your balance sheet, which allows you to go out and generate more money so that you can do a drilling program. So I look at being able to create that initial incentive and the means to be able to clean up well sites as essential in being able to give a kickstart to the junior sector again.
Governments can take action similar to a capital loss tax exemption, where the government incentivizes people to invest their money by offering a tax reduction on the money they lose in an investment. For example, an individual loses $10,000. That individual can write 50% of that loss off against any capital gains. One of the ways the government can take action is by implementing a program called RSTAR. This program will allow companies to recover their costs through royalty incentives.
So the RSTAR program, I think, offers the ideal solution. We've always given incentives to industry so that they can recover costs associated with drilling. When you look at the oil sands, we allow them to pay a 1% royalty until their capital is paid off, and then they go up to the higher royalty rate. That was replicated for conventional oil and gas with the C-Star drilling credit, so they're allowed to have a 5% royalty until they pay off their costs. When I look at these legacy well problems, I look at that as a cost that we should give a similar type of incentive for companies to clean up. So the idea would be, if you go out and do $1 million worth of well cleanup, then you can keep that lower 5% royalty until it's paid off. And then the government benefits when those new wells are drilled and they go back up to the higher rate.
The rules are constantly changing in regards to regulatory expectations of environmental social governance. For example, C-Star, which allows a company to recover drilling costs through royalty incentives, R-Star is designed similarly by recovering liability costs. Beginning 2022, the government is mandating an annual liability spending quota. If a program like R-Star is not implemented, the liability burden will be placed again in the hands of the OWA.
The heavy-handed approach just scared all investors away, and therefore we got no environmental cleanup, and now we have no more investment. So what they tried to do backfired on them.
I think because it is an inherited problem, we've all enjoyed the benefit of it. Many of these wells generated tens of millions of dollars for the company, tens of millions of dollars in royalties for the government. Everything we have in Alberta, our hospitals, our education system, our roads, and all of our infrastructure was built on the basis of this kind of drilling activity. And to now take the view that the last guy standing, holding the liability, has to pay 100% of the cost without some assistance, I think that is, I don't think that's a fair balance. I think unfortunately some mistakes were made in the past. Maybe a pot of money should have traveled along every time there was a transfer so that it was sitting there and able to be tapped when the well reclamation took place, but that didn't happen. So we have to deal with that legacy problem, and I think we have to deal with it in an innovative way, and I think R-Star offers the solution.